This video is dedicated to those brave souls in Insulate Britain. So to all those concerned activists out there, glue yourselves down and enjoy. Hi, this story is about CO2 and its history. I want to give you a nicely balanced view. It can be so frustrating when people don't understand the story of CO2. CO2 is absolutely essential to all life on Earth. After all, it is plant food. I'm going to start the story some time ago, in fact 540 million years ago in the Cambrian period, and look at the history of CO2 since then. Now the Cambrian period was the time when there was a huge explosion of life on Earth, and all our ancestors can be traced back to that development. And at that time, the CO2 levels were about 7,000 parts per million. That's incredibly more than the 400 or so parts per million we have today. And even with this high level of CO2, the seas were not acidic. The opposite. Huge shells grew on animals far bigger than any today. And that growth of shells on animals minute and very large was to be the possible cause of the final extinction of higher forms of life on Earth. Because as time progressed, those animals died and dropped to the bottom of the ocean, and they became coral reefs, they became limestone. They buried the CO2. So CO2 has been buried and buried and buried as life progressed. But CO2 is essential to life. So let's take a look at another graph. Let's take a look at the behavior of CO2 and temperature since the Cambrian period. The black line here is the CO2 and the blue line is the temperature, and that first period there is the Cambrian period. That's when CO2 was as high as 7,000 parts per million. Today it's 420 parts per million or so. And here you can see as the shells are building and dying and building and dying, they're taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and the CO2 is dropping. And as it drops, well, there are bumps, there are variations. The CO2 is being constantly removed from the atmosphere until it gets down to around about 300 million years ago. This was when trees evolved in the Carboniferous period, but as they died, there were no bugs to eat them at that time. And in fact, all the coal in the world was formed at this time. They lay down, they were buried, and they formed coal seams, and they sucked out huge amounts of carbon. But in this first period, just take a look here. CO2 is about 4,500 parts per million, more than 10 times that of today. And the temperature drops. The temperature just drops. It's an ice age, and an ice age absorbs CO2 because water absorbs more CO2 as it's cold. And it gives off the CO2 when it's warm. So it's an ice age even when CO2 levels are over 4,000 parts per million, 10 times what they are today. And in fact, in the last glaciation, some 22,000 years ago, CO2 levels dropped to 180 parts per million, much lower than today. Higher forms of life on Earth, like us, will cease to exist at 150 parts per million. So we were very near to extinction level. But then the glaciation finished, the seas warmed and gave off the CO2. And don't forget, the seas contain roughly 45 to 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. They're the big harbour of CO2, but they take time to absorb it and release it. It takes a lot of time to warm and cool our oceans. So this leads us up to prior to our industrial revolution, when CO2 levels had recovered to around about 280 parts per million. Without man beginning to put CO2 into the atmosphere, this lowering of CO2 would have carried on. And if you project these graphs forward, in about 2 million years, life on Earth, as we know it, would cease to exist. This 280 parts per million is plant starvation level. It's a CO2 drought. And that's what we are in before the Industrial Revolution. And as we know today, we pump CO2 into greenhouses. Just look at the difference here. And when you add 450 parts per million to the plant growth. So we know that CO2 is essential for plant life and for us. We are carbon creatures ourselves. The last phase of Earth warming happened about the year 1700, which was the depth of the Little Ice Age. So it was warming 150 years before the Industrial Revolution. That revolution had to be celebrated because look at the improvement in people's well-being, from lifespans to health. Every aspect of life improved after the Industrial Revolution. And one thing it did do was start to pump in more CO2. So in addition to the natural warming since 1700, we now have the extra CO2, which there is no doubt has caused some warming. Nobody knows exactly how much warming, because all the studies from the IPCC, etc., just do not allow for any natural warming whatsoever. The assumption is that all warming is caused by mankind. So at last, and I hope you're all still glued to your seats, we're looking at the latest graph of CO2 and its growth. There on this axis is the CO2 level, and on the bottom axis is the year. Now the very first thing to note is that we've plotted all the climate conferences on this graph, and none of them have made the slightest bit of difference to the growth of CO2. And it shows that CO2 levels today are almost 420 parts per million. Now Professor Mann, and the founder of the hockey stick, argues that 350 parts per million gets his vote. That's the safe level of CO2, not the 420 we're at today. So when in the long distance past was CO2 at 350 and below? Well, let's have a look at the graph. So all was hunky-dory before 1986. No weather extremes then. No more hurricanes then. No droughts, no floods then. No need to glue yourself to the M25 then. But let's have a think about this. Well, I have an idea. Let's look at the weather and weather extremes before 1986. And what a better place to start than Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, who truly lives in a delusional world. We will just examine what he recently stated.
Whatever you think has been causing the fires in the Mediterranean, or the incredible temperatures in the United States, or the floods in East Asia, today's report by the International Panel on Climate Change could not be clearer. That human beings are causing potentially catastrophic climate change.
So let's start by just looking at those Boris scares. Well, it looks like he's right. Forest fires in Greece, September the 15th. But hold on, it was 1894. In this report, Greece was devastated by some very destructive forest fires. Again, it was over 100 years ago. And again, just 10 years later, numerous devastating forest fires in Greece. Just some 4 years after that lot, yet another pile of forest fires in Greece. Well, it seems at some point been given relief, because now the next big lot of forest fires was 1931. So now let's look at a country who kept very good records of the amount of acreage burned by forest fires, America. This is a graph of the burn acreage lost to forest fires in America since 1927. And as you can see, in the 1930s and 40s, far, far higher than it is today. In fact, that little red bar at the end is the burnt acreage so far this year. Now let's talk about the incredible high temperatures in the USA that Boris refers to. This is a graph of the temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the United States, dating back decades. And you can see that the hottest period was in the 1930s, and the hottest year was 1935. Indeed, up until the turn of the century, 1999 or so, all the government agencies published this set of temperature records for the last century. And these actually agreed with history. They agreed with all the events and all the records of history. Look, it even had that record time of 1935 in US temperatures. But it was US temperatures Boris was talking about. But such graphs did not fit in with the new climate alarmism, and they simply had to change history. So they deducted temperature from the past and added them to the present. And here are the two graphs compared. They simply deducted about 1.5 degrees from the past and added about half a degree more to the future to give this graph that complied with their alarmism. The problem with this absurd attempt to change history is that you can't change history. There are just so many records showing you the exact opposite of what they are claiming. So let's take their modified graph of history and compare it to actual history. So we will look at the super cold period of 1900 to the 1920s. Well, the New York Times was reporting death for millions in the 1921's record heatwave, and it wasn't just in America. Just look at what they wrote. The great heat waves which have spread over the world during the present summer has no parallel in history. There have been hot waves, there have been famines, there have been pestilence at various times and in many places, but none so blighting as terrible as this. Abnormally high temperatures have prevailed in almost all parts of the Northern Hemisphere and have continued for an unprecedented length of time. This doesn't sound like the coldest period in the last 100 odd years. By 1924, there was talk of the glaciers in Glacier National Park melting. They were going to disappear. And in that same 1921 year, across the pond back to the UK, they were experiencing hot weather as well. In fact, a drought, the worst on record. And yet another 1921 report in England, going back to 34 degrees centigrade temperatures, African conditions day after day. A photograph from a decade earlier, in 1911, another killer heatwave they called it. And yet it was supposed to be a very cold period. Well, these ladies seem to be enjoying the heat, not the cold. Now just taking one day on New York Times, October the 3rd, 1921. Let's see what the weather extremes are like then. Leaving Europe and the USA and heading to Korea, there we are, 2 million starving with a super drought and extremely hot weather. Cubans that year weren't having a good time either, with hailstorms and water spouts killing people. And over in Europe, you've got the most severe droughts in 47 years and the most severe flood in 136 years. Looking at another weather extreme, very heavy downpours of rain. Look at the dates in the right-hand column. And as you look down and scan down, you will see only one of them. The last one is after 1986. Now take Boris's third point, floods in East Asia. China, the Chinese floods this year, how bad were they? Well, 4 out of the top 5 deadliest floods in history were in China, and every one of them was a really long time ago and before 1986. And whilst looking at floods, in the USA, Nebraska suffered its worst flood in history, and the year 1935, with CO2 levels around about the 300 mark. This is the graph after they changed the data to make it almost continual warming. And of course, this graph doesn't even allow for the 1970s Ice Age coming scare, when it cooled for the 70s. And in fact, they were predicting that very soon there could be an Ice Age within decades. But between 1970 and 1980, according to this new graph, it warmed, totally going against history. Whereas before they fiddled the temperature graphs, the record shows that cooling period that caused the Ice Age scare. This chart shows how death rates have declined over the last 100 years from natural disasters. But these natural disasters include all sorts of things, volcanoes, etc., not just weather. If you take weather, it's a 95% reduction in deaths related to weather events. No matter how you look at it, be it hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, it is far worse in the past than it is now. And I have done many videos on this subject with a lot of information.
In the simple world of the climate alarmist, all you have to do to control the Earth's atmosphere is change the amount of CO2, increase the amount of CO2, and, well, hell breaks loose. So all we have to do to get back to peace and tranquility is reduce that CO2. Oh, if life was so simple.
Alarmists are using weather events to scare you and know full well that the weather trends over a long time are climate, not individual weather events. As soon as you hear that this or that weather event is a fingerprint of climate change, you are listening to a lie. Because nobody can tell you from individual events. They have to look at a pattern over a long time to see if it's a climate change. The extra CO2 mankind's provided has been put to good use. NASA has reported that the world's vegetation has grown by 14% in a 30-odd year period, and CO2 is responsible for an extra 10% of growth in the entire world's vegetation, the same area as twice the USA landmass. Currently, crop yields throughout the world are at record levels, be it rice, as in this case here, or cereals. We are getting better harvests, better food production than ever before. And a lot of that, not all, but a lot of that, is due to extra CO2. This must be tremendous news for all you volunteer heroes in Insulate Britain, because now you can save a lot of money on glue, stop holding up ambulances and fire engines, and maybe start to understand how the real world is and how you are being deceived, along, I'm afraid, with many others. What I'm asking is that people open their eyes and examine the real science and examine it in line with history and begin to understand the deception that the world is living under.